Hello, Dr. Tracy here. Welcome to week 2. We are getting a little bit of a late start this week because today is Tuesday and normally I'll get everything posted on Monday. But since yesterday was a day off, I'm starting on Tuesday this week. Look for the information next week to be here on Monday morning. This week we are working on Introduction to JavaScript, which contains a lot of basics for you to get started on how to work with JavaScript. Last week, you demonstrated that you had a basic knowledge of HTML. And so building upon that, we're going to start to use JavaScript to make pages more dynamic. Your task list this week is to read Chapter 1, to review the PowerPoint, which I'm going to do with you, to review the resources provided, and you have a discussion and a project to begin working on. The overview of the chapter here. The chapter is going to start by providing a little bit of history about web pages and HTML, and then some formal terminology and concepts of web page authoring. It discusses different styles with JavaScript of client-side scripting and server-side scripting. You will get some basic JavaScript code, starting with variables and coding concepts. So, you're going to get your feet wet with JavaScript. I have added a number of additional resources here. That's because there's a lot of new stuff that's going to be talked about. Whenever anything comes up in the week that says additional resources, it is not required that you review it, but it is recommended, especially when you run into those topics and don't understand them. Here's where you could find more further information. I have included a really good JavaScript tutorial here. I advise you to keep that on standby for this and future assignments. W3 Schools is one of my favorite sites for learning web languages. We will finish off the week with a discussion and Project 1. The discussion this week is to just describe what is JavaScript and what does it do, and link to any page that you find that uses JavaScript and explain how they use it. That's going to get you familiar with the use of JavaScript. And Project 1, which is going to come straight out of the text, includes projects from both Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. So when it says start on Project 1, it's not going to be due for a couple of weeks, but it's good to get started on the Chapter 1 stuff in both chapters so that you're prepared to work on it next week once you get there. So let's go back and take a look at the PowerPoint for this week. Chapter 1, Introduction to JavaScript, gives you an overview, as I said, of the World Wide Web and talks about the differences between client-side and server-side scripting and gives you some basic JavaScript components. The history of the World Wide Web is important to understand because as we built on it, you know from whence it came. It started back in the 1960s as a project called ARPANET. It was developed by the Advanced Research Projects Agency. It was meant to be a communication tool for our country, considering that what would happen if centralized phone or communications hubs went down in the event of some kind of a war. So what ARPANET allowed is information to travel from one place to another without having to go through a centralized hub. So if one area was down, it could be rerouted easily to another one. That concept was the basis of what would later become the Internet. And the Internet became super popular through an invention by Tim Berners-Lee. Tim Berners-Lee invented something called hypertext linking, which was based on a standard general markup language developed years prior, but he included this to be based on a text system that allowed linking to other pages. By having pages that could connect to each other and a system that did not require a central hub, the Internet was just the next thing to happen. So now when we talk about the web and the internet, they aren't the same terms. So the World Wide Web is a collection of pages that are linked together that contain information. And the internet is a collection of computers that can talk to each other and are held together through different protocols that allow them to route through each other without sharing or disseminating information or having any central control. The internet existed before the web. But the web could not exist without the internet. So when we talk about web pages, we're talking about the documents that are on the web that are identified by a URL, or a Uniform Resource Identifier. The Uniform Resource Locator URL describes where the page is located, usually by identifying the server, www.whatever.com, / any folders on that server that it might be contained in, and then the name of the page itself. If the page is not identified, then the default setting is index.htm or index.html. The website, once you send a request by typing into your browser www.whatever.com, it's going to go to find that server that is notated according to the name, and it will deliver back whatever the home page is and handle any requests and provide responses. Understanding web browsers is key to web development because there have been several, and as they change, so does the syntax with the page development. 1993, Mosaic was the original website, followed by Navigator and soon Microsoft Explorer. The browser wars began once DHTML began to develop. On this PowerPoint, it says forced web industry to rapidly develop and adopt advanced web page standards. The problem was with different web browsers that they were putting add-ons that made any web developer have to develop a page several times to fit whatever browser was important. That hasn't really changed a whole lot, honestly. But since 1994, the World Wide Web Consortium was formed, and they oversee web technology standards. I included a link back on the page for this class that shows browser wars and over the years how those have changed or been updated. Okay, so last week you showed me that you could make some hypertext markup language. Then you should be pretty familiar with this. Our hypertext markup language is what most of the web is built on, and then JavaScript runs off the HTML engine. So with basic HTML syntax identifying tags that specify how data will be displayed. You can zip through this part, right? Because this is stuff that you already know. Some common HTML elements, HTML syntax, how to create an HTML document, working with HTML5, which is the most current version of HTML. You know, just a bit of a history on HTML. When it was first written, it didn't do very much. It made paragraphs and headings and bold and italic and bulleted lists. That's about it. There wasn't much more to it because originally it was designed as a way of organizing information and so that it could be identified, which are key parts through bold and italics and headings. Then it started to change because of the needs of the people that were working with HTML. It started to change and require things like the addition of pictures and graphics and colors. And every time it changed and a new version was released, people wanted more changes. So initially what happened is they came out with something called Extensible Hypertext Markup Language, which is XHTML. Also included a link on the page for this one. The XHTML was a way to define your own tags within HTML itself. And that created a syntax that was currently inflexible, and it was kind of difficult, but it did allow for more creation. From that, the web kind of became a mess because there was a lot of different pages that didn't work in different browsers, etc. So the most current version of HTML, HTML5, is been around for a while, and it's the most widely used version, and it is contains a lot of the things that were part of XHTML, but does not allow for that updated. Make your own tags. So we make web page design. You're going to write it in code, and then the browser turns the code into something that'll be displayed. So really the browser does all the work. The web page itself is only a bunch of text. If you look at any web page and you right click on it and say view source, you're going to see that every single page everywhere is just a bunch of text, and that's how it displays the page within your browser. So as it travels the internet, it's not really traveling as a nice pretty web page, but instead a bunch of text that'll be rearranged when it is opened up. That is called the client-server architecture. It's a two-tier system. It means that we have a server that's going to send you that stuff, and then on the front end, you're responsible for the user interface. That means you have the browser that turns it into something pretty. The client-server architecture requests and responses through which a web browser and web server communicate and happen with HTTP. HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol, which is a set of rules that determine the way that pages are transferred from the client, which is you, to the server and vice versa. In occasions, there are a three-tier or multi-tier system, which means there's the client tier, that's you, the processing tier, which is www.whatever.com, and then a data storage tier if the application that you're using requires you to access a database. This allows you for communication to secure devices through a portal, such as if you go onto your bank, and then through your bank, you access your own account. JavaScript and client-side scripting allow you to take the static web pages that are produced by HTML and make them interactive. That's called client-side because that work is done through your browser. The code is executed on your computer when you open the page. The web browser itself is what contains the scripting engine that client-side scripting works with. And this has been around since the establishment of ECMAScript, which is the standard for any scripting language, not just JavaScript. I did put a link to client-server networks on the additional resources section, as well as a link to the ECMAScript standard. The limitations of client-side scripting is that it is not used outside of the web browser. It cannot run system commands or execute programs. Also, people sometimes turn it off, so it cannot always be relied upon. Server-side scripting is different from client-side scripting because server-side scripting is built with a three-tier application. That means if you dial into a web server and then it goes and gets something from a database, the server-side scripting is a server talking to a server. And a server-side scripting can be done in JavaScript, but is most often done in Python or PHP, which are probably the most two popular, in addition to ASP and Ruby. It doesn't run on your client, it runs behind the scenes, but that's how it maintains secure websites and applications that can access data. This is how a web server processes a server-side script. The scripting engine within the web server will then talk to the database to get the information that is requested by a script from the client. Should you use client-side or server-side scripting? Well, the general rule of thumb with that is that if you have a lot of data or information to process, that should probably be kept separate from your main server. Adding JavaScript to your web pages. Okay, so here we start the JavaScript stuff. The basic way to add JavaScript to your web pages is by using a script element. If you're familiar with HTML, then you know an element is just a tag. Get the greater than less than sign around it, and we have a script. But to understand why we do that, you have to give a basic understanding of how JavaScript works and what are JavaScript objects. If you refer back to the JavaScript page, there is a link to the JavaScript document object and the JavaScript window object, just to give you an idea. JavaScript is an object-based scripting language. That means that it does not run all by itself. It needs to run through HTML. It's a scripting language. But it's object-based, meaning that it is built of programming code that is treated as a component, and those objects have procedures and methods. Procedures are things that it can do. And methods, procedures, properties and methods. Anyway, procedures and methods are things that it can do. We'll explore that a little bit further. Forgive my tongue-tiedness at this point. I'm 15 minutes in. I probably should take a break. Haha. In addition to methods, they also have properties, which are pieces of data or values that could be associated with those objects. For example, a window object might have the size of the window, whether it's open or closed. It's minimized. These are things that describe it. Methods would be that you can open it or close it. Methods would also be that you can change the title to it and so forth. So when we work with objects, we can control these things like windows and documents and be able to do things within them. The document object. Please refer to the link on the page for JavaScriptKit.com, which gives you a look at the document object. The document object represents the contents of the browser window, and we use a method of the document object to write something to the browser window. Here is an example of some JavaScript. Notice that we have the script tags to define where the JavaScript starts, and where it ends. And so in between there, this document.write, both of these are JavaScript. It's writing a simple string literal here, is the information is contained between quotes, so it would show up like this. But notice what it's writing is actually HTML. So when it appears in the browser, it will appear as if a paragraph saying plant choices and a link are on the page written in HTML. By being able to do this, you can make links appear dynamically based on events that are initiated by the user. Note that JavaScript is case sensitive. Capital letters and lowercase letters are two different characters in the binary language that the computer understands, so watch out for typos. Comments to a JavaScript program are non-printing lines. If you add a couple of slashes or /* before the first character of a block, * after the last character, you're giving comments to the programmer of things that maybe describe what's going on but won't appear within the browser page. Okay, writing basic JavaScript. We start with variables. To assign a variable, a value to a variable, we have to come up with a variable name. All variables must begin with an uppercase or lowercase letter, or a $, or an underscore. You can use numbers in an identifier, but not as a first character. You cannot use spaces. You cannot use reserved words. These are some reserved words. Don't use them for variable names. When you declare a variable, you use the keyword var, which stands for variable, to say that you are creating a variable such as variable curtime. We initialize that variable by saying the variable, whatever name you picked, is equal to value, semicolon. The equal sign in JavaScript means is equal to, and assigns a value on the right side to the left. This is an example of how to use a variable within a statement. We can use document.write to show the value of whatever the variable is. This would have assumed that you used variable sales total and set it equal to the value that will be displayed. Then you can write the code document.write by including a string literal, your sales total is, and then the value of the variable, and then the ending period and /p to end the paragraph tag. And it will display your sales total as $47.58 if that was the value that was set. Here is the extended amount. Variable sales total equals 47.58. Line 1 is declaring a variable called sales total and setting it equal to the value 47.58. Same with shipping, setting it equal to 10. And grand total is doing some math by adding the sales total and shipping together. Line 4, whenever you see this silly little symbol within the book, what it means is they didn't have enough space in the book to write that on one line, so that means continued on the next line. There really is no line 5, if that makes sense. Don't press enter there. Just keep on typing if you can. When you modify variables, what you're creating is a storage place for a value. And at any point, if you want to change that value, you can reassign it to a new amount. And when you reassign it to a new amount, then as in this one, it's $47.58. Shipping is 10, and now it's reassigned to being itself plus 10, and so the new value would show up. Oops. So as you are building expressions, as we call them, you use literals and variables and combinations with operators in order to include these expressions. Operands are variables and literals contained within an expression. And a literal is something like I'm using an actual number or an actual quote within quotation marks. The operators are plus, minus, asterisk for multiply, slash for divide, and so forth. Now we have an event, and we specify the circumstances that allow a user to interact with these pages. So when you have an event, it's something that the user does. If they click on something, for example, or if they open a web page, we can allow JavaScript to execute. It's triggered according to events. And here are several events that are established through JavaScript that might trigger code to be executed. On click, on key down, on key up, on mouse over, etc. By having events that trigger properties to change or methods to run, then now you can make a web page that has interactivity and is dynamic and not static. When you work with elements and events, you have an event that is associated with HTML and an event handler, which is how JavaScript will execute code in response to whichever event is executed. There are different elements in HTML that have different events. For example, if I have an A element, which in HTML would be a hyperlink, you could use any of the event-related attributes to trigger JavaScript. I could say onClick. So when I use the method onClick that's associated with A, that means that anytime anyone would click on that hyperlink, they're going to trigger whatever follows that. We can also reference these web page elements by using the getElementById method that is part of the document object. Going back to the page for this week, there is a link to find out more information about what events and elements are associated with the document object. When we add JavaScript to a code, we follow certain rules regarding placement. You can include as many script sections as desired, but you need a script element for each section that you're working on, showing the examples below. We can also place JavaScript in the document head or document body. If you place it in the document head, then you put it before the document body, and the statements will be rendered in order of which they appear. You may also create an external file designated by .js. You can write that just in a text editor, and when you create an external file, you don't need to use the script element, but you do add a source tag that'll say where that script element is from. And so as we get into some future information later in the chapter, we're going to work with some libraries that will allow us to use useful generic scripts on the websites, such as validation and XHTML and so forth. So skipping through all that, this gives you a basic start on JavaScript. Okay, so back to the page. Here is the additional resources. Please review these because these are going to be helpful as you continue. Notice that in the project, you will be working with a discussion that's based on some of the information that came out of the PowerPoint, and all that further information is here, including, as I said, a really good JavaScript tutorial. And don't forget to take a look at the textbook. The Chapter 1 textbook contains information that I went over, but in more detail, which will probably be a little bit more knowledge and helpful to you, along with great examples of what HTML would look like with or without JavaScript. And you see some of the examples in here will demonstrate how it's used, how it's created, with some of the examples of the 3-tier system. If you go through here and see things like short quiz, those are good places to start testing your own knowledge, because that's if you've kind of mastered the subjects, or if you need to go back and take a look. The assignments this week are at the end of the chapter, and I'm getting there. They are the hands-on projects. So these are the hands-on projects. And your assignments for this week, I've asked you to do these pieces right here. What I'd like you to do is, with everything you create in JavaScript, I want you to post it online and submit it to me by using a link only. Please don't give me the JavaScript page. I want to see that you've been able to make it work. So by being able to make it work, you have to have a server. To have a server, you have a couple of options. There are free servers and places where you can post your page. May I suggest GitHub, GITHUB, or Replit, REPL.IT. There are also web page servers designed for exactly that, like Webhost. Or you could create your own server. And if you decide that creating your own server is a viable option, then you can read through Appendix A in your textbook, which will help you set up this server software on your own computer that allow other people as clients to send in requests. Okay, that's all for us this week. Oh, that was a lot of stuff to talk about, and I'm tired of talking, but I will be happy to help you with any questions that you have, and I hope to hear from you soon. Have a good week.